I am joined here by Coach Pfaff, who has kindly given up his afternoon this Friday to talk us through some of the ground mechanics that we saw from last week's coaching share. So we did a Coaching Eye challenge and we had some really great comments and some really great questions. But also we noticed that people wanted to see a little bit more in depth. So Coach Pfaff is going to talk us through, first of all, what he's seeing here, the context within what the athlete is doing, and then he's going to talk us through what we should be seeing and some associated factors. So Coach Pfaff, over to you, and thank you very much for your time on this.
All right. Well, happy to be here. I think we ought to talk some of the big buckets that we look at first and foremost. So perspective matters. So we try to get video from a rear perspective, also from a frontal perspective, and obviously a side panning perspective. In the main, we're looking at what is the shank doing. So the lower leg, during various phases of gait, and the strike angle onto the ground of that shank at the moment we touch down, and the shank angle at toe off when we leave the ground, and what the shank is doing in between ground contacts. We spend a lot of time looking at the foot axis. So imagine a pull through the foot. We call that the long axis of the foot. So we monitor two main features of that foot axis. Is it externally rotated? Is it neutral, or is it internally rotated? And then also we look at supination, the ability of the shoe or the athlete's foot to land on the outer border. And then during stance, generally what happens, we go from supination to pronating off the ground. So we're going to look at the amount of pronation and the amount of supination and see if there's a relationship through that. And then we're also looking a little bit about joint dynamics. What is the distal tib fib joint doing, and perhaps the talus during these various phases. So those are some of the big menu items that we're going to screen here. This is a pole vault athlete in a new set of shoes, and the purpose for this review was to see how these shoes were changing gait dynamics compared to the shoes that he was using. We seldom just shift across the shoes blindly. We want to see, are there any landmines or icebergs with the new shoe model? And this was a radically different design. So that was the purpose of really honing in and looking at this video.
Great.
So this is a rear perspective. So the athlete's got a standing start. So it's kind of a roll through the foot. And you can see as he rolls through the foot, there's external rotation of the foot. So the foot's neutral here. And then that axis externally rotates laterally. And then we see a pronation off the ground. On the rear leg, what we notice on the pickup is there's pretty massive external rotation of the foot axis right off the ground. Then it comes to neutral. And then this is kind of concerning. This is a real radical external foot rotation. And unfortunately, this is quite common in pole vaulters because they carry the pole and their body's a little bit torqued or biased to rotation in the torso. So the leg has a tendency to externally rotate to maintain balance. So we look at how much external rotation there is of the foot. And you can see that not only did the foot externally rotate, but the shank, the lower leg, externally rotated. And so pretty normal sprint contact coming in here, ball of the foot, slightly supinated. As weight comes on and they go to mid stance, the heel sinks, actually touches the ground, and then they pronate off. And so we're looking at how much supination, the pronation is occurring. What is the relationship of that supination angle to that pronation angle? You can see if you look at the medial malleolus of the ankle there, you can see quite a bit of dumping, what we call medial dumping. That ankle really rotates and dumps medially. And that puts a lot of stress on the Achilles. Obviously, a lot of the posterior chain muscle groups, soleus, plantaris. So that's a concern. We monitor how far this dumping is occurring and the speed of the dumping. Next step, again, normal supination, ball of the foot, but the foot and the shank are drastically externally rotated to us, and a massive medial dump of the ankle. So you can imagine the torque that's going through the Achilles and a lot of the structures through the sinus tarsi and the tarsal tunnel, with that kind of activity. So, and then as speed increases, we're looking if there's a change. And as you can see, as he's going faster and further down the runway, this external rotation and medial dumping is just getting worse and worse. And there you can see the foot's almost 45-degree deflection, external rotation. So this is pretty radical. And then on the split screen, we're looking at the takeoff foot. And generally in the jumping events, you want to see a heel first rolling action to the strike. And so he's a little bit what we call hot. The plantar flexion is a little bit early, not quite a flat or a rolling contact. And then we talked earlier about looking at shank positioning. And as you can see at touchdown here, the shank, the lower leg is obtuse. It's an obtuse angle to the ground. And generally you would want to see that in good running, the shank perpendicular. At takeoff, it is a little bit obtuse because you put the foot out a little farther in front of the center of mass in order to jump. And then we're looking at the amortization angle. So once he's down, how much does that ankle flex before he leaves the ground? We look at forefoot bridge. So does the forefoot obtain a bridge position? And then we look at the shank angle at departure. So as he leaves the ground, what is the angle of the shank to the ground? And then we flip from the pole vault runway to the track. And so we're looking at the shoe in normal running dynamics. So again, we're looking at how the foot rolls, the speed of rolling, the amount of foot bridge before departure, the departure angle of the shank. What is the angle of the shank to the ground? And you'll notice on this video from behind, in these shoes, we don't see near the amount of external rotation on the right foot that we saw on the pole vault runway. And, like we said, carrying the pole causes a lot of torque. And a lot of times the foot and the shank will rotate externally, trying to balance that torque that's occurring in the spine.
And Coach,
So,
did this athlete ever have Achilles problems as a result of that external rotation?
some minor complaints, nothing major. Pretty robust. He was pretty intense with foot mobility exercises and soft tissue therapy. But for sure, that's an energy leak. And it did take some therapy time away from some other areas, to be proactive to prevent, Achilles issues. Generally, these ground dynamics kind of went more upstream on him. So, a lot of issues with the SI joint and lower back. So where in that food chain disturbing forces, manifest, it varies. For a lot of people, this issue would appear in the foot, possible stress fractures of various bones. It could be Achilles tendinopathy or, various ankle tendon ligament disorders or something in the shank. For some people, this disorder moves up the food chain and irritates the knee area with patellotendinitis or popliteus plantaris irritation. Some people are pretty robust in those joints, so the undue forces just go up the food chain. For some people, it's hip labral. Some people, it's SI joint or low back. So, there's not a one-to-one relationship. If you do this, you're going to get an injury here. kind of depends on how you compensate and how your body manages these forces.
And if you're seeing this extent of external rotation and you don't have the skill sets to do the therapy that you obviously, worked on with this athlete, is there anything a coach can do, beyond sending them away to a therapist? What can a coach with limited skill sets in therapy do to kind of mediate some of these potential injury risks with that external rotation?
Well, we have athletes obviously all over the world on any given week. And, a lot of times these athletes don't have the finances or the resources, or we don't have the manpower to have therapists with them. And so we build out self-therapy routines, self-mobilization routines, with various bands and band distraction, floss band work on some of the major muscle groups. So we develop a toolbox of self-therapy ideas and concepts, that over time have proven to keep us out of jail, so to speak, or, keep a small fire from becoming an inferno until we get access to proper care.
Mm-hmm.
So self-therapy schemes, while not perfect, let's be honest, a lot of us as coaches don't have resources or expertise around us. So in my opinion, it's better than doing zero.
Yeah. And these mechanics done, like, compared to a sprinter or an athlete that isn't running with an implement, are they ones when this athlete's running just on the track without the pole, how far from kind of ideal would you say his mechanics are, like within bandwidth? Is this a good model that coaches could follow, what they're seeing here in this video, for example?
Well, we see these same issues in sprinting. We get a lot of asymmetry because of the block start. The front leg's doing more work in different types of work than the rear leg, and then people running around curves will develop asymmetry. So it's quite common to see that outside leg have excessive external rotation on people that run curves. Why do they do that? Well, it's a mechanism for fighting centrifugal force on the curve. So it's not unheard of to see these kind of disturbances. I think the big thing that, as we're looking at this rear view of him just running without the pole, is those variables that we looked at are way less apparent than they were when he was carrying the pole. Like you can remember in the pole vault runway, on his next to last step, that foot axis was almost 45 degrees external, where here, it's, maybe 15 degrees external. So I don't think they're that dissimilar. And, I see a lot of these same problems in field and court sport athletes, whether it's rugby or European football or AFL or, what have you, any basketball. We see these same issues. And, kind of our intent with showing this video and sharing it on social media is to get people maybe looking at ground dynamics with some different lenses or different perspectives. And, I want to constantly circle back to our big buckets, the foot axis, the shank angle, the movement pathways, and the various foot dynamics of supination to pronation, and how the foot rolls and how the heel sinks after initial touchdown. Those things are biomechanical truths. Everybody's exhibiting them. And, it's our job to figure out the bandwidth allowance, okay, how far away is it from a theoretical model, and over time getting a movement map for our athletes. And if they're way outside their normal bandwidth, then maybe we intervene with therapy, or we go to plan B on the menu item in the training session.
Mm-hmm. Now, Coach, a lot of people may have read about the windlass mechanism and be perhaps slightly confused as to what that is and what that means. Could you just talk us through exactly what that is and what we'll see with that and why that occurs?
Well, there's a lot of debate. The windlass mechanism has to do with foot dynamics. So what's happening, how force being transferred and utilized during ground support. And the research has evolved into tribalism. Does it occur? What effect does it have? What does it instigate, and so on and so forth, which I think is really pretty far beyond scale and scope of most coaches' audiences.
Mhm.
So, I'm more of a big picture guy. It's like, what are the big buckets of gait? Well, we know that the foot supinates before it strikes, and at high speed, we strike on the ball of the foot. And then we know that as we go to mid stance, the heel sinks towards the ground to put various structures on stretch and to allow the joints to translate. And then as we go to the foot bridge, we start to move into pronation off the ground, off the big toe. Those are things that are actually occurring. Now, what is the driving mechanism? That's a PhD study. And I think the windlass mechanism debate, is way down the rabbit hole. For most coaches, access or understanding or utilization, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. That's good to understand, Dan. And we're talking about rolling off the big toe there. Now, if an athlete does not roll off the big toe and is coming off the middle of the foot, for example, what would that indicate and why may that happen?
Well, our first step is to look at joint dynamics. So are the joints moving through normal ranges of motion in a timely manner? So the talus and the calcaneus actually glide over one another. And the tib-fib joint distally actually displaces and it undulates and oscillates. And then the navicular has to drop at a certain phase of the gait, and the cuboid has some mobilization. So these joints of the foot and the lower leg play like a piano. And if these joints aren't moving and synchronizing in the right moment, then structures are going to pay a price. You're going to overbias certain muscle groups or certain tendons or certain ligaments. And it may not result in an acute reaction, but a chronic reaction over time can then become acute. So a lot of Achilles ruptures, they don't come out of the blue. Athletes report Achilles tightness or Achilles inflammation or Achilles irritation for weeks and months on end before the Achilles actually ruptures. So, we kind of use the phraseology, of a time bomb. We don't want a time bomb to go off.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if it's above scale and scope, but I'm going to stop and put up another screen. So this is a fluoroscope video during walking gait. And so in walking, we land heel first and we roll through the foot. And there's a degree of supination, and then there's a degree of pronation off. There's a foot bridge moment. But what I want to highlight is if we look at the talus and the calcaneus and the joint spacing and look at navicular cuboid region and how the tibia and the fibula move during gait, these joints compress and glide and slide. And if there's impingement or malalignment in these joints, then structures are going to have to pay the price.
And Dan,
So,
you mentioned the foot bridge there. So for coaches that haven't heard that term before, what exactly is that indicating, and what would we be seeing with that foot bridge part of the movement?
So in propulsion, a common biomechanical feature is we see the tarsals create an arc, and we call this gross design a foot bridge. It's kind of like a bridging, like you'd use in billiards or whatever, where you build your hand a bridge to strike the pull cues. So we call this a bridging action, and it's identified at the moment when this curve is at its most acute phase. And what we want to see in good gait is a nice, smooth, continuous movement through the foot. So we're heel first, now weights rolling forward, and then the forefoot engages to do the final propulsive movement. So we want to see a smooth movement, smooth timing. And like I said, we want to see these joints gliding, compacting, and releasing in a timely manner. So if we really hone in on the tibia here, you can see a certain spacing. We can see that spacing change, and we can see how that tibia rotates about the talus joint. So all of these joints are constantly gliding and sliding and rotating. And this foot bridge is just one facet of the gait, and it's a snapshot that we take at the moment that the body weight rolls to the final digits of the foot. And so we have a lot of Jones and fractures, Lisfranc fractures and whatnot, and that they occur in this forefoot region. And a lot of times it's the immobility or the athlete's inability to get into this bridge position that creates those undue forces causing those injuries.
And Dan, how may footwear contribute to, the ability of the athlete to either execute these positions or not? So we saw there that athlete was obviously wearing different footwear that they're used to. There was a pretty significant heel. That's a triple jump type spike. What that made the mechanics look like either in sprint spikes or in trainers or in cleats if an athlete was wearing those types of footwear?
Yeah, footwear is a big variable. And, in my generation, we in the 70s and 80s and whatnot, shoe companies got into this anti-pronation shoe, trying to limit or restrict pronation. And I was like, why would they try to limit something that's natural? Like, it just didn't make sense to me. But, they sold billions and billions of shoes with that ideology. So, yeah, shoe design has a huge factor on how these joints are interfacing. So now with all these super shoes that we have with carbon plates and carbon rods and different types of foam and whatnot, we're altering the speed of force transmission and the vectors of transmission. And for some athletes, they can weather the storm, and some athletes, that storm gets them, and it may show up as foot problems or shank problems or knee problems. We're seeing epidemic numbers of cartilage surgeries in long distance runners that we've never seen before. And, the only big variable that's shifted is, people have gone to these stack shoes and, carbon featured shoes, when they race. So it's a concern. And this is why I said earlier on the talk, it's super important to get movement maps as people, different times of the year, different types of running speeds, different types of shoes, different types of surfaces, and try to build, what we call a common denominator movement map. And then what kind of bandwidth allowances to those movement variables are we going to allow before we intervene or question what we're doing.
And there are coaches that, are at far extremes of the continuum in terms of footwear. So, there's some coaches that, would purport doing barefoot running, doing warm-ups in barefoot. And there's coaches that say, put spikes on day one of the training year, and there's every iteration in between. Where do you sit within that? And where do you sit with that whole orthotic debate in terms of intervening and what we put within our footwear?
Well, you're trying to get me into trouble here. I think, as with any training variable, you want a gradual introduction to stress, and then you want to progress in a timely, masterly manner. And so we do what we call segues. So, we may do the first training cycle of the year and training flats, very neutral training flats, nothing jazzed up. And then, for us to move into spikes, we might do a few sets in the spikes and the rest in training flats, and then slowly build to where we're doing the whole workout in spikes. It's the same thing on the jump runway. We may start out doing teaching progressions and some short run jumps and trainers, and then segue slowly into the jump spikes. And it's the same approach when we change a model or a type or a design. We'll do some of the workout in their old spikes and some in the new spikes and slowly segue. So for me, the heuristic is a gradual adaptation to the shifts that you've created with the shoe.
And, clearly this would probably be talking to more of an elite athlete population. If you're a coach working with athletes twice a week in a club environment who aren't moving particularly quickly, would it be safe to say that they can probably move into their kind of generic spikes from kind of day one of the training year, or would you still be as cautious and as progressive in your choice of footwear for those types of athletes?
Well, I mean, a lot of times the elicitation to use spikes depends on speed and the type of running workout that you're doing, and you know, the surface that you're running on and the weather conditions and whatnot. So if the track is very worn and it's super wet, you know, then I'm probably going to lean to using spikes if we're at, you know, high velocities. But if we're not at high velocities and there's not a lot of slippage or whatnot, I'm going to lean more towards the Segway.
Truly holistic education over this past 30 minutes. So we do appreciate your time on this. And thank you very much. And we'll catch up on this again soon, I'm sure.
All right. Thanks for having me.